Can you believe that over 900 people, including men, women, and children, voluntarily drank poison and died without anyone forcing them? What could possibly compel intelligent, rational, and educated individuals to calmly walk into death? That tragic event wasn't a mass murder by some tyrant. It was something far more chilling, a brutal reminder that stupidity can be more dangerous than evil. On November 18, 1978, in a remote jungle settlement in Guyana, more than 900 people died in a single day. They drank a cyanide-laced concoction, a deadly poison. And what shocked the world the most was this: they did it willingly. There were no guns pointed at them, no physical coercion. Just the voice of one man, Jim Jones, whose words alone convinced hundreds of people to end their own lives. These weren't helpless, mindless followers. Many of them were educated, capable, even thoughtful individuals. So how did this happen? How do rational people, with the ability to think critically, fall so far that they choose destruction? We often believe that intelligence shields us from irrational behavior, that smart, educated people simply wouldn't fall into such a trap. But history tells a very different story, one where stupidity, not evil, plays a central role in humanity's worst tragedies. This is exactly what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian and resistance fighter during Nazi Germany, observed in one of the darkest chapters of human history. While many blamed evil for the horrors of the 20th century, Bonhoeffer made a far more disturbing observation. Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than evil. But why? How can something as harmless as stupidity be more dangerous than deliberate malice? We're taught to fear evil, to believe the greatest threat to society comes from those with wicked intentions, people who knowingly cause harm. But Bonhoeffer saw something far more insidious, something that operates under the surface, often unnoticed, and far harder to stop. You see, evil can be confronted. It has logic, motives, and can be debated, reasoned with, even defeated. Evil. People are often aware of their actions. They calculate risks, understand consequences, which means, at least in theory, evil can be resisted through intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. Stupidity, however, is a different beast entirely. A person driven by stupidity doesn't act out of intent to harm, but their actions can lead to catastrophic results. The most terrifying part? Stupid people don't know they're being stupid, and even worse, they refuse to change. They reject information, deny facts, ignore logic, and cling to their beliefs no matter how much evidence is presented. Evil has limits, but stupidity does not. It spreads, sustains itself, and worst of all, thrives in society without resistance. Bonhoeffer also made a crucial distinction. Stupidity is not the same as ignorance. An ignorant person simply lacks information, and that can be fixed. With knowledge, they can learn and grow, but a stupid person is different. They don't just lack knowledge, they resist it. They actively avoid the truth. They shut down when faced with logic and reason. And this is what makes stupidity so dangerous. It feeds on itself. The deeper a person falls into stupidity, the harder it becomes for them to escape. Once someone falls into the trap of stupidity, they don't just cling to false beliefs. They double down on them. They begin surrounding themselves with people who think the same way, people who reinforce their ignorance and validate their distorted views. Any information that contradicts their beliefs is instantly dismissed, labeled as fake, biased, or propaganda. They don't seek truth. They seek comfort in the opinions they already hold. And at that point, logic becomes irrelevant. There's no way to reach them, no argument that can penetrate their mental armor. But this isn't just an individual problem. In fact, this mindset has fueled some of the greatest catastrophes in human history. Time and again, leaders have made catastrophic decisions not because they lacked intelligence, but because they refused to accept reality. Take the NASA Challenger disaster in 1986, a tragic example of willful ignorance at the highest level. On a freezing January morning, the Space Shuttle Challenger was scheduled for launch. Engineers had repeatedly warned that the O-ring components, crucial to shuttle safety, were not built to function in cold temperatures. The data was clear, the warnings were loud and urgent, but the decision-makers chose to ignore it all. They were convinced that the launch had to happen. And 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger exploded in mid-air, killing all 7 astronauts on board. It wasn't ignorance that caused the disaster. The engineers knew the risks. It was stupidity, a deliberate refusal to acknowledge inconvenient truths, an unwillingness to change course even in the face of undeniable facts. History is full of similar stories. Political leaders have ignored intelligence briefings. Generals have marched into wars they couldn't win. Corporations have brushed aside expert warnings. Why? Because of arrogance, overconfidence, and the inability to admit they were wrong. Bonhoeffer also recognized another terrifying aspect of stupidity. It's not just a personal failing, it's a social disease. Stupidity thrives in groups. It spreads like a virus, infecting people who might otherwise be rational. The larger the group, the less likely individuals are to think critically for themselves. That's why propaganda works. That's why mobs form. That's why history keeps repeating itself. When people become part of a collective, they start outsourcing their thinking to the group. They stop questioning, stop analyzing, and just go along with the majority. And as Bonhoeffer warned, the moment someone stops thinking for themselves, they cease to be an individual. They become a vessel for stupidity. This is why the greatest disasters in history weren't caused by a few evil masterminds, but by large groups of ordinary people who refused to question authority, refused to think critically, and refused to take responsibility for their actions. And perhaps the most chilling part of Bonhoeffer's theory is this: stupidity is resistant to correction. No amount of evidence, no amount of logic, no level of debate can change the mind of someone who chooses ignorance over truth. They don't lack information, they reject it. This is what makes stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's view, the greatest threat to society. Not war, not crime, not even organized evil, but stupidity, the silent, invisible force capable of leading entire nations to ruin. And this is exactly what makes stupidity so dangerously effective. Unlike evil, it doesn't need a grand scheme, a hidden motive, or a calculated plan. It doesn't even need intent. It simply exists. And that alone is enough to leave devastation in its wake. We often make the mistake of thinking stupidity is something that belongs only to individuals, a result of someone's lack of intelligence, education, or wisdom. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a far deeper and darker view. He believed that stupidity is not just a personal weakness, but rather a social force, something that spreads like an infection and grows stronger through group dynamics, peer pressure, and blind conformity. One foolish person might make a bad decision. But when stupidity is allowed to flourish unchecked, when it's backed by groupthink, obedience, and propaganda, it becomes something much more dangerous, a societal disease capable of steering entire nations into ruin. Stupidity doesn't grow in isolation. It thrives in numbers. The very moment individuals stop thinking for themselves and begin to rely on what everyone else believes, they open the door wide for stupidity to take over. This is why it spreads so easily, because it's contagious. Like a virus, it's passed from person to person. It echoes through the crowd, reinforcing itself. until it drowns out all reason. Bonhoeffer observed that when people are placed in large groups, whether political, religious, or cultural, they begin to surrender their individual judgment. They no longer analyze, no longer question. Instead, they begin to follow, not because they're forced to, but because everyone else is doing it. And if everyone believes it, it must be true, right? That's the dangerous foundation of groupthink, a psychological phenomenon where people suppress their doubts and conform to the majority, even when the majority is clearly wrong. And once groupthink sets in, stupidity spreads like wildfire. It creates a feedback loop. One person's poor thinking validates another's, which in turn reinforces the group. Eventually, questioning the group becomes taboo, even threatening. That's how blind obedience is born. And blind obedience has always been the fuel behind history's greatest atrocities. Dictators and authoritarian leaders understand this all too well. They know that a society filled with educated, critical thinkers is hard to control. But a society that follows blindly, that doesn't question, that accepts whatever it's told, that is every dictator's dream. Adolf Hitler didn't need a nation full of evil people to carry out the horrors of the Third Reich. He only needed a population that was too obedient, too afraid, too unwilling to think independently. The Nazi regime didn't thrive because Germans were inherently cruel. It thrived because propaganda turned ordinary citizens into unthinking followers. They used mass rallies, emotionally charged speeches, and manipulated media to send one relentless message. Don't question, don't think, just follow. And millions did exactly that. Even those who had private doubts were afraid to speak up. They feared isolation, they feared punishment, so they stayed silent. And in their silence, evil was allowed to grow. It wasn't brute force that made the Nazi regime so powerful. It was the passive compliance of an unthinking society. And that is why Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity was even more dangerous than evil. Because while evil requires intention, stupidity requires nothing but silence. So the next question is, why do people fall into this trap so easily? What makes someone surrender their thinking and follow the crowd even when deep down they know something is wrong? Psychologists have long studied this disturbing tendency, and two of the most famous experiments in modern history reveal just how easily ordinary people can be manipulated into obedience. To answer that, we turn to one of the most disturbing experiments in modern psychology, one that forever changed our understanding of authority and obedience. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a now infamous experiment to test just how far people would go when following orders. Participants were told they were part of a scientific study on learning and memory. They were instructed to act as teachers and deliver electric shocks to a student, a person in another room, every time that student gave an incorrect answer to a question. What they didn't know was that the shocks were completely fake, and the student was actually an actor. But to the participants, the setup felt real. Through a wall, they heard screams of pain, desperate pleas for mercy, and eventually an eerie silence, as if the person had passed out or worse. And yet, most participants kept going. Even when they were sweating, shaking, visibly distressed, even when they begged to stop, they continued pressing the button, believing they were delivering potentially lethal shocks. Why? Because a man in a lab coat, an authority figure, calmly told them to continue. This experiment revealed a terrifying truth. Ordinary people are capable of committing horrifying acts, not out of malice, but out of obedience. And when a society is conditioned to obey authority without question, stupidity becomes a powerful tool of oppression. But blind obedience isn't the only reason stupidity spreads. There's another, equally insidious force: social pressure. The fear of being the only one who thinks differently. Psychologist Solomon Asch ran an experiment to explore exactly this. In his conformity experiment, participants were placed in a room with several other people, all of whom were actors pretending to be participants. Everyone was shown a series of lines and asked to identify which line was the longest. The correct answer was obvious, but then, one by one, the actors began giving the same obviously wrong answer, on purpose. When it came time for the real participant to respond, over 75% conformed at least once, giving the wrong answer just to match the group. Even though they knew it was incorrect, they chose to blend in rather than stand out. This experiment exposed just how easily people can abandon their own judgment in favor of the crowd. And once that happens, stupidity spreads like wildfire. It's no longer just a personal flaw. It becomes a force, a system that shapes history. Stupidity is why authoritarian regimes rise. It's why propaganda works. It's why misinformation spreads unchecked in today's digital world. And the most dangerous part? Stupidity thrives in silence. It grows stronger every time people choose comfort over confrontation, every time they look away instead of standing up. This is why Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed we all have a moral responsibility to resist stupidity, wherever and whenever we see it. Unlike evil, which we can recognize and oppose directly, stupidity must be fought by awakening the individual mind. We must help people reclaim their ability to think for themselves. Because if we don't, if we let that flame die out, then history, as Bonhoeffer warned, will keep repeating itself. But perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: stupidity doesn't only live among the uninformed or uneducated. It often thrives in the halls of power. Bonhoeffer pointed out something deeply unsettling. The more power someone has, the more likely they are to become blind to their own ignorance. We tend to assume that world leaders, CEOs, and high-ranking officials must be incredibly smart. After all, how else did they get to those positions? But history has shown us time and time again, power and intelligence do not always go hand in hand. In fact, power can create a dangerous echo chamber, a feedback loop where the more authority someone gains, the less able they are to recognize their own stupidity. One of the most catastrophic side effects of power is that it isolates people from reality. The higher someone rises, whether in business, politics, or any position of authority, the further they drift from the consequences of their own decisions. They stop feeling the impact of their actions the way ordinary people do. And the very first casualty of unchecked power? Self-awareness. This is where the yes men effect comes into play. People in power rarely hear the truth. Instead, they build a circle of advisors, employees, and loyal supporters who echo their opinions, reinforce their beliefs, and tell them exactly what they want to hear. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of blind loyalty. The result? A powerful person becomes trapped inside an echo chamber of their own ignorance, never challenged, never questioned, never told, you might be wrong. Over time, this creates the illusion of infallibility. Because they've achieved success, these leaders start to believe their instincts are flawless. If I'm in charge, then I must be right. That mindset leads them to dismiss criticism, ignore warnings, and refuse to consider alternative perspectives. But it gets worse. The more powerful someone becomes, the less they personally feel the consequences of poor decisions. If a CEO makes a reckless move, it's the employees who lose their jobs. If a politician passes a disastrous policy, it's the public that suffers. This creates a dangerous, self-reinforcing cycle. Power breeds arrogance. Arrogance blinds people to their own stupidity. That blindness leads to bad decisions. And when those decisions backfire, the truth gets buried by the very people who depend on the leader's approval. And so the cycle continues. Until one day, reality hits. But by then, it's usually too late. History offers no shortage of tragic examples. Take the 2008 financial crisis. Long before the global crash, experts were warning that the US housing market was a ticking time bomb. Economists raised red flags about subprime mortgages and unstable financial instruments. But the executives running major banks and financial institutions ignored it all. Why? Because they believed they were too powerful to fail. They convinced themselves that the market would keep rising, that their complex models were infallible, and that the risks weren't real. They silenced critics, dismissed expert advice, and doubled down on reckless strategies. And the result? A collapse that nearly brought down the global economy. It wasn't just greed that caused the crash. It was stupidity, nurtured and amplified by power. But perhaps the most chilling example of this kind of power-induced stupidity is the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The engineers at the nuclear plant were fully aware of the risks. They knew that pushing the reactor beyond its limits could lead to catastrophe. But Soviet leadership, driven by arrogance and a desperate obsession with showcasing their technological superiority, dismissed every warning. On the night of the disaster, when red flags started lighting up the control panels, the supervisors refused to listen. They ignored their own experts, overrode critical safety systems, and insisted that the dangerous experiment must continue. The result? An explosion that released 400 times more radiation than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Entire cities poisoned, countless lives lost, a radioactive legacy that scarred generations. This wasn't just a technological failure, it was a failure of human judgment, the result of power blinding decision-makers to reality. And this dangerous pattern isn't just historical, it's psychological. So the question is, what happens in the human mind when power takes hold? Why does it distort self-awareness and suppress the ability to recognize failure? Psychologists have long studied this troubling phenomenon, and the findings are deeply alarming. Power doesn't just influence behavior, it alters perception. It makes people more prone to overconfidence, more resistant to empathy, and more likely to make foolish decisions without seeing the risks. Let's break that down. Power breeds overconfidence. Studies show that the more power someone holds, the more likely they are to overestimate their own intelligence, judgment, and abilities. They start to believe they're always right, simply because they're the ones in charge. This inflated sense of self leads to dangerous miscalculations, especially when surrounded by people too afraid to challenge them. Power diminishes empathy. Leaders in high positions often become detached from the struggles of ordinary people. They stop listening, stop relating, and stop considering alternative viewpoints. The higher they rise, the harder it becomes to stay grounded in the realities of those they lead. Power encourages recklessness. When someone starts to feel invincible, untouchable, they begin taking greater and greater risks, often without seriously considering the consequences. The more insulated they are from accountability, the more boldly they act, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. So the question becomes, can this cycle be broken? Is there a way to stop power from becoming a gateway to stupidity? Bonhoeffer believed there was, but it requires something rare: constant self-reflection and intellectual humility. The most effective, respected leaders in history weren't those who demanded blind loyalty. They were those who surrounded themselves with people brave enough to challenge them, who listened to criticism, stayed connected to their communities, and were willing to admit when they were wrong. But sadly, that level of humility is the exception, not the rule. Most people, once they've gained power, refuse to question themselves. They filter out dissent, silence opposing voices, and retreat further into their own echo chambers. And that's exactly why stupidity continues to flourish at the highest levels of society. This is why Bonhoeffer's warning is more urgent than ever. A society that places blind faith in its leaders without accountability is destined to repeat history's greatest mistakes. Because again, stupidity is not just a personal flaw, it's a contagious social force. It spreads quietly, rapidly, like a virus, infecting people who might otherwise think rationally. And today, in the digital age, where information travels at lightning speed, stupidity has become more dangerous than ever before. In the past, ignorance spread slowly through rumor, dogma, or state-controlled propaganda. But now, stupidity has a rocket ship: social media. How misinformation outpaces truth. Studies have shown that false information spreads up to 6 times faster than factual content. Why? Because lies are often more exciting, more shocking, more emotionally charged than the truth. People don't share something because it's accurate. They share it because it validates their beliefs, stirs emotion, or makes them feel part of a larger group. And once misinformation takes hold, it's nearly impossible to reverse. People don't like admitting they were wrong. Instead of facing uncomfortable truths, they double down, clinging even harder to falsehoods. And in doing so, they deepen the roots of stupidity, the viral power of conspiracy theories. History is littered with conspiracy theories that gained mass traction, regardless of how absurd they were. From the flat earth movement to the denial of climate change, people have repeatedly chosen easy lies over difficult truths. Take the anti-vaccine movement, for example. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence proving vaccines are safe and effective, millions of people believe they're dangerous. This belief didn't spread through facts. It spread through fear, peer pressure, and coordinated misinformation campaigns. And the pattern keeps repeating. The more people accept a false idea, the harder it becomes to challenge. Eventually, entire societies can become prisoners of stupidity, making irrational decisions that harm not just individuals, but entire nations. Throughout history, dictators and authoritarian regimes have depended on stupidity, not just as a side effect of power, but as a strategy to maintain it. Take Nazi Germany, for example. Adolf Hitler's regime understood one thing very clearly. To control a population, you don't need everyone to be evil. You just need them to stop thinking. So what did they do? They took over the media, saturating it with carefully crafted narratives. They silenced dissent, labeling anyone who spoke out as an enemy of the state. They repeated lies so frequently and with such emotional force that millions of ordinary Germans began to accept horrifying policies without resistance. Not because they were naturally cruel, not because they hated reason, but because they stopped questioning. This is what philosopher Hannah Arendt famously described as the banality of evil, the terrifying idea that the worst atrocities in human history weren't carried out by monsters, but by ordinary people who followed orders, went along with the system, and never paused to think critically. And this isn't just a relic of the past. Even today, propaganda shapes political beliefs, deepens division, and makes people follow leaders blindly, never stopping to ask, why? So what's the cure? Thinking for yourself. Bonhoeffer's warning is as sharp now as it was in his time. Stupidity spreads when critical thinking stops, and the only way to break the cycle, the only way to resist, is to actively challenge what we're told. to question popular opinions, and to seek truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it makes us uncomfortable. Because if we don't, then yes, history will repeat itself again and again and again. But here's the deeper question. If stupidity is now deeply embedded in our society, amplified by misinformation, reinforced by power, and fueled by obedience, is there any real hope of escaping it? Are we trapped in this cycle forever? Bonhoeffer didn't think so. He believed that stupidity is not just an intellectual failure. It is, at its core, a moral failure. People don't choose stupidity because they're dumb. They choose it because it's easier. It's easier to go with the crowd than to think for yourself. Easier to obey than to question. Easier to accept comforting lies than to face painful truths. But while stupidity is powerful, it's not inevitable, and it can be resisted. Bonhoeffer believed that breaking free from stupidity requires a conscious effort, a deliberate, daily choice to think critically, challenge authority, and expose yourself to uncomfortable truths. So, what does that look like in real life? It starts with one simple habit. Don't accept information at face value. Train your mind to ask questions, not to be cynical, but to be thoughtful. When you hear a claim, pause and ask, who benefits if I believe this? Is there actual evidence? Does this make logical sense, or am I just agreeing because others do? Start looking for contradictions. Truth can withstand scrutiny. Lies cannot. If a belief only survives by ignoring inconvenient facts, it's time to challenge it, and beware of emotional manipulation. Propaganda, fake news, and conspiracy theories often bypass logic entirely by targeting your emotions: fear, anger, loyalty. Learn to recognize when something is trying to make you feel, instead of helping you think. Because stupidity thrives in those moments, when people stop questioning and just react. The more you train your mind to be curious, the more resistant you become to falling into the trap of blind belief. And one of the biggest traps of all, the echo chamber. It's a space, digital or social, where people only hear one perspective, where opposing ideas are ignored, mocked, or attacked. And the more time people spend in these echo chambers, the more extreme and unthinking their beliefs become. Here's the hard truth. If everything you consume only confirms what you already believe, you're not learning. You're just reinforcing your own ignorance. To break free, you have to challenge yourself. That means reading different perspectives, even the ones that make you uncomfortable. Surround yourself with thinkers, not just followers. Engage in conversations with people who disagree with you, people who make you think, who push you to defend your views with logic, not just emotion. Because here's the difference. A smart person welcomes debate. A stupid person avoids it, or worse, attacks it. And in today's world, where social media decides what we see and think, this kind of mental discipline is more important than ever. Do a digital detox, at least from time to time. Social media. Algorithms are designed to keep feeding you content that aligns with your previous clicks, likes, and beliefs. It's not about truth. It's about engagement. But when you only hear one side of a story, you're not thinking. You're repeating. And repetition without thought, that's the very foundation of stupidity. One of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's most chilling insights was this. Stupid people don't see themselves as responsible. They follow orders. They conform to norms. And when asked why they acted the way they did, they say, "I was just doing what I was told." That's how history's greatest atrocities happened, not because of evil masterminds, but because millions of ordinary people stopped asking questions. Authority should always be questioned, just because someone holds a title, a politician, a CEO, a religious figure, doesn't mean they're right. Their words, like anyone's, should be tested against logic, against evidence, against ethics. Don't confuse compliance with morality. Just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean it's right. History is full of people who followed the crowd straight into disaster. Don't be one of them. Take responsibility for your own thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Don't believe something just because someone told you to. Believe it because you've thought it through. Because real intelligence isn't about having the most facts. It's about having the courage to think independently. So the next time you hear a popular opinion, or see a trending news story, or get caught up in a political debate, pause before you agree, before you react, before you repeat. Ask yourself, am I really thinking for myself, or am I just following the crowd? Because stupidity thrives in the exact moment we give up our ability to think, and the only way to defeat it is to reclaim that power, to ask, to question, to challenge, and most of all, to never stop learning. In the end, the choice is yours. Will you think, or will you be controlled? Remember this. History's greatest tragedies weren't just caused by evil men with sinister plans. They were made possible by ordinary people who refused to think, who followed orders blindly, who accepted lies without resistance, who stayed silent when they should have spoken. We like to believe we would have done better. That if we had lived in Nazi Germany or under a rising dictatorship, we would have resisted. We would have seen through the lies. We would have spoken out. But would we, or would we, like so many before us, go along with the crowd, accept what we're told, and let history repeat itself? Because here's the truth. Stupidity isn't just a problem of the past. It's happening right now. Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't just about history. It was about the present. It was about us. Just look around. People still believe in absurd conspiracy theories. They still follow political leaders blindly. They still reject evidence when it challenges their beliefs. Entire societies are being shaped, not by reason, but by propaganda, misinformation, and social pressure to conform. And the tools may have changed. It's no longer mass rallies and government-controlled newspapers. And here's the most terrifying part. The more stupidity spreads, the harder it becomes to stop. We like to think that the most dangerous people in history were evil, calculating villains with dark intentions. But the truth, many of them weren't evil. They were just too stupid to know better. Think about the darkest moments in human history. Genocides, wars, oppressive regimes. These weren't carried out by monsters alone. They were made possible by ordinary people. People who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. People who never paused to ask, am I being manipulated? Am I blindly following orders? Am I contributing to something terrible? And this is why Dietrich Bonhoeffer feared stupidity more than evil. Because evil has intent. It makes plans. It chooses to do harm. But stupidity, it requires nothing. It doesn't scheme. It doesn't plot. It simply follows, without question. And once it spreads far enough, it becomes unstoppable. A silent, invisible force that sweeps through societies, unquestioned and unchallenged. So how do we escape the trap? If stupidity truly is the greatest threat to any society, then the most radical, most powerful act of resistance is shockingly simple: to think. Think before you believe. Think before you repeat. Think before you follow. Because the very moment you stop thinking for yourself, someone else will do it for you. So here's a final challenge for you. Not a test, but a mirror. The next time you see a viral headline, a trending opinion, a belief that everyone seems to accept without question, pause, and ask yourself, who benefits if I believe this? Is this my conclusion or someone else's? Am I being a thinker or just another follower? Because here's the thing. Stupidity doesn't come with a warning label. It doesn't knock on your door and say, hey, you've joined the unthinking masses now. It spreads quietly, invisibly, until one day you wake up and realize history has repeated itself again. So if you truly want to escape the trap, if you want to protect your mind in a world built to control it, then remember this: the only way to resist stupidity is to never stop questioning. At Cyphus, that's exactly what we do. We explore the hidden forces that shape how we think, the biases, the psychological traps, the invisible strings pulling at our decisions. If you want to learn how to think clearly, deeply, independently, in a world that rewards blind obedience, then subscribe, stay curious, keep questioning, because at the end of the day, the choice is yours. Will you be a thinker or a follower? Let's keep learning. Let's keep thinking. And most of all, let's never go blind.